Thank you, Professor Hirsch. So to begin, maybe we can ask the panel to Dr. Yehuda, Dr. Champagne, Professor Schwab, to share any responses that you have to these questions raised by Marianne.
Yeah, and I hope to hear from the audience as well. Briefly, my talk didn't address stopping epigenetic changes because I think all things being equal, I'd rather have a knife than not have one. And I just want to figure out how not to get hurt with it and how to use it towards greater good. So, you know, it's very hard to discuss a topic like epigenetic transmission and intergenerational trauma in this kind of setting because, of course, we want to end racism and violence, but that's not what the epigenetic work is addressing in any way, I think. I think to the extent that after you listen to a talk like this, you say, hey, wow, this isn't made up stuff. There are ways of kind of retaining things. As technical as that sounds, that's pretty much where we're at in the field, but not in a place where this information can be used towards solutions. One of the ways to get me to cringe is to have a scientist talk about how to reverse the methylation marks that are observed in association with intergenerational trauma, because to me, it feels like you're asking someone to get rid of the white blood cells when there's an infection. As we don't know anything, we don't know enough to do that yet. We're still at a wait and see place.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, maybe I'll add on that theme. You know, I think there is often, especially in a kind of a medical school model, it's like, oh, something's broken, so we need to find a way to fix it. And but what is broken here is not the epigenetic change, it's the context in which people are living and developing. And so the problem with these transgenerational effects is that they are there and they are reinforced by people's experiences across their lifespan. And if you don't change that, then any effort you might make to reverse an epigenetic change will be lost because it will be reapplied and reinforced again. So the only hope to intervene is to change the world. So small ask, but.
Okay, that fits well because I'll start with something about changing the world. And in relation to Marianne's question about the methodology, because during the past years, I have lived with a profound sense that everything gets worse and worse in the world, everywhere, increasingly. But when you ask the questions about the methodologies between the sciences and the humanities, I realized that actually one thing I feel positive about and one thing I feel much more optimistic than I did in those first encounters in the 80s. We had a lot of meetings with in gender studies between women scientists and the women in the humanities, and there was a profound gap that we could just not overcome. Mm-hmm. In recent years, with my own work, after I did the transgenerational trauma and Holocaust and other violent histories, including colonialism, slavery, and so on. After that, I worked on nuclear politics and the legacies of Hiroshima, and I had a lot of invitations to biology departments, neuropsychology departments, environmental studies, sustainability studies, and so on. And I found that that's perhaps also about the porosity of boundaries. I found that the conversation had changed to a much more productive and generative mode where both sides were there to learn from the other, but also to listen instead of to know better. So it was, and both, I think both, we in the humanities, but also I see it from the scientists with whom I talk, there's more humility and more coming to terms with the fact that there are severe limits of our knowledge, and sometimes it's more important to put important questions on the table than insist on answers. And perhaps the last thing to the transgenerational, the dimension of transgenerational transmission in relation to what I presented. Perhaps it's also best illustrated anecdotally. When I first heard about my sister's illness, after the first shock to thinking about her that way, the next thing that came to my mind was, oh my God, my grandmother once told me that when I gave her a novel for her birthday, that she can't read novels anymore because when she's half through, she has forgotten the beginning, and so she can't finish it. I had not thought about this anymore. That was the first thing that came to my mind. And then my mother, after my father passed away, was diagnosed with a psychotic break. She hallucinated him still alive. And the next thing where I went spiraling, perhaps this is genetic, and oh my God, what if it's genetic? When does it start with me? What about my children? And it was so intense that I actually did a brain check. I went to get a neurofeedback brain testing and all kinds of things. Just, I needed that as a reassurance, but it shows that there's already an ingrained transgenerational fear. We are afraid of the genetic determination. And the other thing, the friend Harry who died has grandchildren, and his wife took the grandchildren to visit. And one of them, I think he was 6, said, Opa doesn't speak anymore, does he? And they said, no, he doesn't speak anymore. And he said, will that happen to all of us? Was also. And that, I think that's how psychologically the transgenerational transmission, how it works with stress in that context, I simply don't know.
Thank you. I know that there are going to be a lot of questions from the audience, so I want to make sure we have time for people to ask them. And I think there's just the microphone in the middle. Is there another one just set there? So if anyone would like to, please walk around and have your questions ready.
Good evening. Fantastic. This was outstanding. I do have a couple of questions. My background is nothing like yours, but the cortisol levels, they're in the urine. Are they also in the bloodstream? And do the lowered cortisol levels, besides the cortisol levels, have there been other hormones or compounds that have been showing up as markers to support what you so perfectly described this evening that's going on?
Yes. I chose to tell the story of the early work we did, which was, the very first finding was in urinary cortisol. Obviously, we worked very hard to measure cortisol and other hormones in blood and develop creative ways of looking at the whole endocrine system and its interaction with molecular factors. So 20-minute talk, you know.
So a yes or no answer would be great. If there are other markers that
Yes,
that
there are
being
lots of
looked
other
at.
markers.
That's
yeah.
great. Appreciate that. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. My question is about the effects of the trauma. I want to know what you think in terms of whether it's the same effect if the person who has been subjected to the trauma doesn't remember the trauma because their brain has protected them. Does the change still happen? And that's my question.
Who's it directed? Who would you like to answer your question?
You.
I would suspect that there are changes even if you don't have a conscious memory. Consciousness is only one state. And I think that the body does carry the impact of memories, whatever that means. So a lot of times in the case, we see in the car accidents, severe traumatic injury, the patient is absolutely adamant that they can't remember aspects of the event, and yet they kind of reenact a lot of terror responses to reminders. So there probably are ways in which the body remembers, but that part of the brain that tells you that you remember may not be functioning well.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, my name is Deepak. I'm a Fulbright visiting scholar here, and thank you very much for your lecture. It was magnificent. So 2 related questions, maybe to first 2 presenters. It's more relevant to what you presented. So is there some time threshold during which the stressors can influence epigenetics, or this doesn't play such a big role? And second thing is the interaction between the parents and offspring necessary to transmit the trauma? I'm asking this because in Argentina, for instance, we had this case of severely traumatized parents, but children were kidnapped and given to, I'm sure most of you know, to different families. Would you expect that the symptoms of trauma and PTSD would appear in those children as well? Thank you.
So the only way to dissociate direct experience from, let's say, something that's transmitted through non-direct experience through biological process is to use animal models. And what the animal models suggest is that even in the absence of any interactions with a caregiver, that there's this biological trace that can occur because of parental experience. Mm-hmm. Now, again, the caveat is in an animal model, and they're much shorter lived, so they have a shorter lifespan, and so the proximity to the time of the exposure and the time that you're looking at the outcome is much shorter than you might see in humans. Your first question, though, was
the time threshold. For instance, especially in these torture cases, the exposure was short, sometimes several months or weeks. Would you expect that this would create epigenetic cases, or the time doesn't matter at all?
I wouldn't say the time doesn't matter at all, but you're going to get effects even of very short exposures. And I think we need to understand better, how severe short traumas versus long chronic, stresses have an effect. Certainly they will have different effects, but they will both have an effect. We're now in the process of looking at how acute stress, even, the way you stress out humans is make them stand in front of people and talk. so that's
experienced epigenetic changes right
so
now.
we could measure your epigenetics before and after. But again, the question is, how do the rise and fall in your stress hormone, in your cortisol, affect epigenetic changes acutely? And what kind of experience do you need to have a sustained effect? So I would predict that most experiences that we have will have acute effects. The question is, what is going to leave such a lasting mark that genes will be shut off in a way that will affect you in a long-term way?
Thank you so much.
Hello. My name is Chelsea Allen. I just want to first say I really appreciated hearing from you all. Can you hear me okay? Okay. I'm a student and I'm a doctoral student in the School of Social Work, and I'm specifically interested in studying historical trauma and intergenerational trauma transmission within African American populations. And I'm just curious to know if you all are familiar with any work studying epigenetics as it relates to discrimination or race-related stress or violence.
So there is some very interesting work looking at epigenetic age acceleration in African American populations. So, you know, there is a notion that if we have good self-regulation and good self-control, that we can succeed in life, do well in school, do well in college. And most of that work comes from wealthy Caucasian populations. And, you know, there's good health outcomes, good educational outcomes. If you look at African American populations, you see that same relationship in terms of academic achievement, but there's a cost to that in terms of accelerated epigenetic aging. And so there's now, I think, much more interest in thinking about how these phenomena that we study in different groups applies more broadly and varies based on race and ethnicity. So there's that kind of work. There's certainly a lot of epigenetic aging work that's coming out with differences by race and ethnicity. I think more and more work on discrimination, first looking at how individuals respond acutely when they experience discrimination, but again, then looking at what the long-term effect is for the epigenome. So it's something that's certainly in the works.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, that was great. So just a quick question. I might have missed something, Dr. Yehuda, but you kept saying it was lower levels of cortisol, and that was the opposite of what I would have expected. It seems sort of ironic, but there was an explanation for it that went too quick and I missed it. But could you explain why we're finding lower levels as opposed to higher levels?
Yes, I can. It has to do with the fact that when you're exposed to trauma, probably earlier in development, you can re-regulate the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis as a result mostly of things that can happen in childhood, or it's called developmental programming. So most of the people that develop PTSD to adult traumas have had an earlier traumatic experience. And the idea, I don't know if it's a negative thing or a positive thing to have lower cortisol levels, but I do know that it reflects a different kind of adaptation where the receptors for stress hormones are exquisitely more sensitive to environmental effects. So one of the things that we know is that if you have lower cortisol levels at the time of a trauma, then you are more likely to develop PTSD. Well, why is that? You're less stressed. Well, no. The body mounts a very coordinated and large response to fight and flight that includes the activation of the sympathetic nervous system and the activation of a lot of brain regions. Cortisol is actually really important for helping shut down some of those physiological reactions in response to stress. So it's kind of like the brake system. And if you're driving fast in a car, you want the brakes to be working. So one of the things that we're actually studying now is whether giving a very high dose of cortisol or hydrocortisone in the emergency room a few hours following trauma exposure will help prevent post-traumatic stress disorder. So again, these ideas in biology, I agree with reductionism. Sometimes when we think that we see cortisol and we see stress, we make the mental leap that what's bad is the cortisol, as you so elegantly said it, Dr. Champagne. Sometimes what's bad is that the danger, that exposure to the stressor, but in response to that, the body needs to mount a coordinated response. So people talk about amygdala activation. Oh, that's not good. No, you want your amygdala to talk to you in response to a challenge. And all of these things are very adaptive features of the body, maybe when they're used too much, maybe when there's too much stress. This can change the way that the body reacts because of epigenetics, because experience changes the way that the body reacts. So the low cortisol seems linked to enhanced glucocorticoid receptor activity, which seems linked to epigenetic changes, and probably influenced by a lot of other genes, because there's really no such thing as studying one gene in isolation, because it's all about the networks. I hope that explains it.
It's helpful, thanks.
Hi, my name is Idris Turbi Hidalgo. I'm a freshman at CC. My question is, I don't know, how is epigenetics affected/displayed through microaggressions or even types of parenting styles, and how do you test that? Yeah, it's a heavy question.
So could you just I missed a bit of the question.
So how is epigenetics affected/displayed through microaggressions or even parenting styles?
Microaggressions. Yeah, no one's looked, I think, at microaggressions. Parenting styles, I wouldn't say there's any strong literature on parenting styles. Most of the literature has been very extreme differences in parenting or in the experience of the child. So abuse and neglect, institutionalization. So these are not, going to be typical experiences, but are really a first pass at trying to see how the early experiences of the children lead to epigenetic changes. So the more subtle changes, harder to quantify, and then thus harder to link to the epigenetic effects.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Hi. I work in corporate psychometrics for pre-hire selection, and there's a new, very controversial but very broadly used method of taking things like data points on people's faces, ways that they react to things essentially, and mapping them against psychometric models in order to determine whether or not they have sort of the proclivities to make them good hires. So are you neurotic? If not, you're not, you're not hireable. These are all, to your point earlier, these are all sort of based on sample populations that tend to be well-to-do, tend to be Caucasian, tend to be North American. One of my questions is, and I circle this all the time, do you have any point of view on, ethical point of view on basically lilting psychometric evaluation in those ways towards, or at the least controlling for populations that may react differently because of that inherited trauma?
Well, I'm so glad that I've already got my job. It's a whole new world. I think that we have to all be on the lookout for ways in which this information is weaponized and used inappropriately. This comes up all the time. A lot of my work is funded by the Department of Defense. And it used to be that you had to write the proposals in the exact right way, because you have to be very careful about a claim that you would have a risk factor for PTSD that might exclude someone from joining the service or exclude them before you even know whether a disease will be expressed. I think that the point of this work, what I take home from it, is that nothing's a done deal in your face or anywhere else, because positive environmental experiences, they change you for the better, and we got to give people a chance. And so that is what I like to take home. What I like to take home is that it there's not determinism. But I completely understand how somebody might use the information in ways that would mostly stigmatize, marginalize, or exclude people from having a fair chance. And I sincerely hope that this work won't lead to that.
Hi. My question is with respect to, the talks were about the 9/11 or the Holocaust survivors and collective tragedies. What about personal tragedies in terms of if, a mother or a father is experiencing bereavement or going through bereavement while, raising or while being pregnant? Are there epigenetic influences there, and is the trauma carried over generations then?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. Researchers can do better work if they pick an event that is one event that many people were exposed to, because it minimizes variance or noise in scientific collection. There's still plenty of individual variability. But I would never make a statement that somebody who experiences a trauma that other people experience has experienced something worse than somebody who has experienced a trauma quite privately. In fact, there might even be an advantage to somebody experiencing a trauma in a group, because then they have each other. Trauma can make people feel very isolated, very lonely. For anyone who's experienced something personal, it's their personal Holocaust. And I would not expect different biological or psychological consequences, and in particularly things like sexual abuse, which are not disclosed. And so not only do you walk around with the sequelae of a really horrific experience, which is associated with the highest prevalence of PTSD, but you're isolated because you can't really talk about it. So I think a trauma is something that kind of is a watershed moment in your life that divides your life into a before and after. For everyone, that's going to be different. It's harder to study that because so much of the biologic signal is how old were you, when did it happen, what else happened. And so I think part of why our work has given us a signal through all the noise is that basically when you study combat veteran from a certain war, they're about the same age. They're about the same age when they were exposed. It's been that many years since that age. So you can keep it clean, but that does not mean that individuals are not suffering or that this work is not relatable to people who suffer isolated events.
Thank you.
I think this is our last question. Thanks.
Great. Thank you all for your work and being here tonight. I wanted to ask, it came up a little earlier, the ethical implications of some of your work. And one thing that stood out to me was you mentioned how we think about the self as a story. And I'm wondering how all of your work has led you to think about personal responsibility and individual accountability.
Can you say one more thing about like responsibility for the particular story told, or where do you?
Well, I had in mind just, as you mentioned, we understand what a self is through our experience and through a narrative, perhaps. And it just seems to me that your work, in a way, you mentioned this word determinism, does imply that maybe we don't have as much agency as we would like to think.
I think I would answer it with exposing where the limits of our knowledge are at every time, or exposing our doubts. Whenever we tell stories about ourselves or others, we are also, I think, aware that this is not exactly and empirically what happened. We are fashioning it. We are creating a continuity that perhaps doesn't. We are making it, but also we are influencing others with it. And that comes, of course, with a tremendous responsibility. But perhaps I'm also thinking about it in transgenerational terms and also in terms of our work as a therapist. When we work as a therapist, we are confronted with the stories of others. And I got a letter in response to my book, Haunting Legacies, where I have a chapter on replacement children and the trauma that children were supposed to replace a child that had died earlier for the parents. I mean, the Spiegelman story, who was supposed to replace the brother who died in the camps. And the woman who wrote me said she went for years and years into therapists, and each time she brought up the feeling that she's haunted by this sibling her parents talk about all the time. The therapist said, you didn't experience this. Stay with your own problems. Stay in the here and now. That's a mythology. That's the mythology of your parents. And you see how the responsibility comes in relation to the story. We are also responsible to take the other stories and give it the benefit of the doubt, not dismiss it. And it came, of course, at the time when transgenerational transmission was, in general, often just dismissed as a myth. So I'm not sure if that really answers your question about the responsibility, but I hope it goes a little way.
I mean, if I could add something to that, when you got up and talked about Mouse, you said, this is the story of Art Spiegelman and his father. Actually, the mother is in the story, but she committed suicide when he was 11. But not a page goes by where the effect of that isn't part of what gets said or what gets felt by him and by his father and by everyone else. And often what you're grappling with when you have a relationship, in his case, difficult with his father, does have to do with where is mom and what happened there, and some internalized or externalized anger about why the relationship is now just between him and his father and not his mother. So in terms of boundaries and narrative, there are people in the story and there are people in the relationship that aren't in the relationship, but that doesn't mean that we're not dealing with them, because we certainly are.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just add, of course, I couldn't agree more, and I've written a whole chapter on the mother, but I think that one of the things that motivates your question is, if this is passed down to us, where is our own agency and responsibility if we're already marked by these previous stories that we didn't even live through and that we're inheriting? And I think one of the ways that Rachel Yehuda responded to that was, I think, really helpful by saying, let's figure out what we can do and what some of the positive effects of inheritance can be that are not only deterministically negative. Also, the other thing that's been said in this panel is that the social context is really important. Maybe we can't change those levels of various gene expressions, but we can change, or maybe we can change them by changing the environment as well. And as far as I understood what we've been talking about, we don't know yet what environmental and life changes, how they actually then over a lifetime can actually also change our biologies. So taking responsibility for making the world a better place might actually affect not only our own lives, but also our social worlds and our political world. So I think responsibility is a really important question to ask in this particular context.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a great point to end on.